Hey everyone, it's Maureen from the Embryology Lab in Syracuse, back for another round of questions with you all. I'm just going to give it a few minutes for people to join in, and if anyone joins in, let me know if you can hear me. It was pretty warm in Syracuse over the weekend. It was 70 degrees on Sunday, which was out of the ordinary. It was very windy though, so a little tough to do very much, but we have snow again today, not to disappoint. All right, it looks like some people are coming in. Can someone just comment and let me know that you can hear me okay? All right. So today, I thought I would talk a little bit about, oh, there we go. I got the messages now. You can hear me. Thank you. Thank you. So today I thought I would talk about how we check your embryos in the lab and when we check your embryos in the lab, just give you a little idea of the process, the journey of your embryos through the lab. And then I will start answering questions. So not a crazy topic today. All right, so when you come in for your egg retrieval, after your egg retrieval, you will know how many eggs you retrieved. So before you leave, you'll know how many you start with. And then later that day, we are going to strip any of the extra cells off of the egg, the cumulus cells that surround the egg, so that we can better visualize if the egg is mature or not. So we're checking to see how many eggs are mature. And then in the afternoon, we ICSI any eggs that are mature, so that's injecting one sperm into each egg. And then we let them culture overnight, and the next time we check them is what we call day 1, so the next morning. So the day of your egg retrieval is considered day 0 for your embryos. That's the day they're fertilized, and then in the next morning on your day 1 check, we're looking to see how many did indeed fertilize. So we're looking for 2 pronuclei, which I've shown this picture before, but I'll show it again. So you can see, let's see, 1, backwards, 2. The 2 circles in the middle, 1 is coming from the egg and 1 is coming from the sperm. So we're looking for a normally fertilized egg to have 2. So that's what we're checking. And then we're going to put a note in your chart with how many were fertilized, how many were injected, how many were fertilized, and a nurse is going to call you day 1. So she's going to check up on you, make sure you're doing well after your retrieval, and then give you the update about how many embryos you have. So from there, it kind of depends on what your plan is for the cycle. Some people will do a fresh transfer, meaning just a few days later, they will transfer the embryos back into your uterus. And some people are freezing the embryos, meaning that we're going to freeze the embryos and do a frozen embryo transfer in a future cycle. And some people are doing PGT testing, which is when we biopsy the embryos, we take a few cells off the outside, send them to a genetic testing lab. We use Cooper Genomics, and we're looking to get the PGT results back before you do a transfer. So you'd also be freezing embryos. Yes, so the 1PN is a little tricky. So every once in a while, I see the comment there about the 1PN. Every once in a while, an egg will be, we won't see 2 pronuclei, we'll see 1, so we call it a 1PN. And what happens is actually those 2 pronuclei merge together. So when we see 1 pronuclei, it could be that it's abnormally fertilized, or it could be the pronuclei have already merged together. So we do hold on to those eggs that were fertilized, that we just see 1 pronuclei, and we wait and kind of see how they develop. Okay. All right, so when your nurse calls you on day 1, that's when you're super confirming your plan for the embryos for that cycle. So she's either going to schedule your fresh transfer, or you're going to confirm that we're freezing embryos this cycle, or doing PGT and freezing embryos. So that's really the last time we get instruction from you and the nurses as to the plan in the lab. So the next time that you're going to hear from embryology is either on your transfer day or once your embryos are frozen. So we do check the embryos on day 3. So we have our day 0 is egg retrieval, day 1 is our fertilization check, we don't check them on day 2 because on day 2 we're looking for 2 to 4 cells for normal development, and we don't really get a lot of information on day 2. So sometimes if eggs are artificially activated, they can divide into like 2 to 3 cells, but we don't really know if that's growing properly or it was just artificially activated and it's not going to continue to grow. So we really don't get enough information on day 2 to make it worth taking the embryos out of the incubator. We want to disturb them kind of as little as possible because the incubator is controlled to be just like the womb. So we don't really want to be taking them in and out any more than we have to. So the next check is day 3. And on day 3, we're going to refresh the media. So we're going to move the embryos from their one dish to another dish to kind of give them a fresh home. And we are just making sure that the embryos are on track for development. So we're not actually grading them specifically on day 3 unless we're freezing them or transferring them. If we're holding them till day 5 and day 6, we won't actually give specific grades. We just have a general impression of if they're good, fair, or poor, and they're moving in the right direction. So if you have 10 embryos on day 3 and you're either having a transfer on day 5 or freezing or PGT, we're not going to have grades for you on day 3, but we will make sure that they are progressing the way we want them to progress. Okay, so it's different for everyone, but so if you're having a fresh transfer on day 3, you're going to come to the office. We're going to show you what your embryos look like that morning. We'll have pictures. We'll go over the grading information. We'll decide what to transfer, and then we would freeze whatever embryos were remaining. If we're freezing embryos on day 3, you'll get a report in your portal, which will have photos, grades, and how many were frozen. So that's the next time you hear from embryology, is once your cycle's done. So if you're not transferring or freezing on day 3 and you're holding out to day 5, 6, or 7, the blastocyst stage, we do check the embryos on day 5 and we'll freeze, transfer, biopsy, whatever we can that day, but we don't expect all the embryos to be at a blast on day 5. So anything that hasn't grown completely to that stage, we're going to check again on day 6 and repeat the process. We'll either biopsy or freeze whatever we can. And then sometimes we'll even wait until day 7 if you have some embryos on day 6 that just haven't quite made it yet, but we want to give them every chance to develop. So once we're done with the freezing process, we know how many we've frozen, biopsied. That's when you'll get your report in your portal. So it'll have how many embryos were biopsied or frozen, and the grades of the embryos. So if you So this question was saying when you need to decide whether you're doing a fresh transfer. So day 1 is when you're going to decide if you're doing a fresh transfer. That's because you are likely going to have medication to take to prepare your lining for the transfer. So you would be starting that medication after your retrieval. So the nurses, the clinical team, they are keeping track of you and your body and your levels and your lining. And if you're planning a fresh transfer, yeah, you would know on day 1. So we know how many are fertilized on day 1, so we have a general idea that yes, we will have something to transfer. So that's why you have to decide on day 1. So hopefully that gives you a little overview of when we check the embryos, when you're going to hear from embryology. So that day 1 phone call is the most important for us so that we know your official plan. The nurses can check on you and they can confirm what we're doing for the cycle. So Lauren, that's day 1 after retrieval. So retrieval would be day 0, and then the next day when the nurse calls you, that's day 1, and she can tell you how many are fertilized, and that's when they confirm the plan, which typically doesn't change very much. It would already be the plan that you're, intending for that cycle. Okay, so is embryo glue always used for transfers, or do you have to request it? We use embryo glue for all of our transfers now, probably for about a year. It's been standard. It used to be that you had to request it, but we switched over and we're using embryo glue for everybody, so that makes it easier. So you don't have to request it. That will just be included. So Jordan has an interesting question. She's asking about transferring her day 3 embryos. She has some with 8 cells and some with greater than 9 cells. And is asking why is the 3/8 better? They're probably all very similar, but you know, a textbook embryo development would see 8 cells on day 3. So if you have more than 8 cells, it's growing just a little bit faster, which is totally fine. But we would choose that ideal, quote unquote, ideal embryo. If you have greater than 9, that's as high as we count. We just count up to 9, and then if it's more than that, we just say greater than 9. But if you had 10 cells or 12 cells, it's probably just a few cells have continued to grow and divide, and that's totally fine. All right, so go ahead and ask me some questions, guys. What's the best way to decide which embryo to transfer based on various embryos and numerous grades? We usually just start with your best embryo, your best graded embryo. So you can always ask your embryologist. If we get a task for an FET, so you're going to talk to the nurse about how many embryos you want to transfer, and the nurse is going to send the lab a task. So that's like the order to thaw the lab on, or to thaw the embryo on a certain day. And if they just say 1 embryo, we're going to start with your best graded embryo. If you have a specific request, the nurse can pass that along too at that time when she schedules your transfer. Alice was asking about what percentage of PGT tested embryos come back as no result. It looks like you had 2 no results. That's pretty rare. I think our percentage for no result is like 1 or 2%. It's very low. Cooper Genomics provides us with quarterly statistics to let us know our euploid rate, our aneuploid rate, our mosaicism rate, and our no result rate, and then compares it to nationwide. And we have very good rates. We have better rates than the national average in terms of we have more euploid embryos, less mosaic embryos, and less no results, which means we have a great lab. I get this question a lot, which gives what's better, a fresh transfer or a frozen embryo transfer? Statistically, they are about equivalent here. It used to be that, you know, years ago, the way that we froze and thawed the embryos wasn't as good as it is now. Just the technology has advanced so much, so it's not super risky to be freezing and thawing embryos. So the advantage of doing a frozen embryo transfer is you get to wait, let your hormones kind of settle, and then prepare your lining and make sure it's exactly where you want it for your frozen embryo transfer. So it really just depends on your hormone levels and your lining, you know, during your fresh, you know, egg retrieval IVF cycle. If everything looks like it's good and the doctor says go ahead and transfer fresh, that's great. If they say to freeze the embryos, that's fine too. So they're pretty much equivalent at this point. This question is asking, is it okay that all my embryos are 3s? So if they're day 3 embryos and they have a grade of 3, that means good. If it's a blastocyst embryo and it has a grade of 3, that's just how expanded the embryo is, and a 3 is totally fine. So a 3 is an expanded blastocyst. A 4 would be also an expanded blastocyst, but the zona is the shell on the outside. The zona is starting to thin. A 5 would be hatching, and 6 would be totally hatched out. So I would say most commonly the embryos are 3s on day 5s and probably 4s on day 6. So 3 is totally good. Is a 3M good? Yes. That's a morula. So an M, morula is usually what we see around day 4 of development. So if we have a day 3 embryo that's growing a little bit fast and the cells are starting to compact and we can't really count the cells, that's when it's considered a morula. And if we graded it a 3, that's the part that means good. So a 3M is good. Okay, thoughts on thawing day 3s and refreezing on day 5. That's really going to depend on how many embryos you have and your transfer history. If you've done a bunch of day 3 transfers and you feel like they just aren't working for you and you want to try transferring a day 5 embryo, that is something you could look into, thawing the embryos and trying to grow them to day 5 and refreeze. There's just no guarantee that they're going to continue growing and make it to that blastocyst stage. So it's risky, but depending on your situation, you could talk to an embryologist who can look at your specific chart and see if that might be a good idea for you. If you have a lot of day 3s, some people, end up with 10 to 12 day 3s over a bunch of cycles, and they really want to try thawing them all and just freezing and transferring blasts. Some people do that as well. So it's an option, but I would probably have you talk to an embryologist that can look at your specific history. You're welcome. Oh, we have a visitor. I didn't put a sign on the door. Okay. I see a question about empty follicles. That's not something that I can answer. You'd have to talk to the clinical team. Do we destroy embryos if they do the PGT testing? The only time that we discard embryos is if we get I'm not sure what the question is, but if you get abnormal results for your PGT embryos, they come back as abnormal and you want to discard them, we don't do that until we get a written and notarized or a signed and notarized consent from you and your partner to discard embryos. So we're not just going to automatically discard embryos if they're abnormal. Some clinics do that, but we don't. We hang on to everything. Do we use rescue IVM techniques if eggs aren't mature? We don't do special in vitro maturation in our lab. So that's I think this question is referring to if you retrieve eggs and they're immature, you can culture them in a special media to try and get them to mature. We don't do that here. We will hold the eggs overnight, and if they do mature the next day and you didn't have anything that fertilized, we could ICSI those eggs the next day if they've matured overnight. But it's pretty rare. It's not super common that we do it. If you're transferring 2 embryos, are they thawed and kept together or separated? So that's a good question. We typically will, so the embryos are frozen individually. So if we're thawing 2 embryos, we're verifying which ones we're thawing. We thaw them one at a time, but then they will go together in your transfer dish. The only time we keep them separate is if they're PGT tested embryos. So say you're transferring embryo number 2, that's a boy, and embryo number 3, that's a girl. We keep those separate because if something happened where you didn't go through with the transfer and we had to refreeze the embryos, we would need to keep those separate. If it's just an untested embryo, say you're transferring like an AA and an AB, we'll just put those together because we can always regrade them if we did for some reason have to freeze, if something didn't go through with your transfer. But we'll keep them separated if they're PGT embryos. Or if they are donor eggs. So a lot of patients will end up having some embryos that were made from donor eggs and some embryos that were made from their own eggs. And when we thaw those, we keep them separate for same reason. If we had to refreeze them because something happened and you couldn't do your transfer, we need to know which embryo is the donor egg embryo and which one is your own. On transfer day, we changed our mind to do 1. not tested, so I'm assuming we don't know which one we transferred. We might know. It depends on how closely they were graded. You know, we can look at the pictures and see what we refroze. Can you freeze day 3 embryos? Yep, we freeze day 3 embryos every day. We do a lot of day 3. So the difference between freezing on day 3 and day 5, it's usually a numbers game. So typically if you have like 4 or less embryos on day 3, we prefer to freeze or transfer on day 3. That's to make sure that we're giving your embryos a chance, and we only expect about half of the embryos on average to make it from the day 3 to the day 5 stage. So if you only have, you know, 1, 2, 3 embryos and we try to hold them to the blastocyst stage, there is a chance that you wouldn't have anything to freeze or transfer. So that's why some patients will elect to do day 3. If the embryo doesn't continue growing after day 3, do you think it's an egg or a sperm problem? That's really difficult to tell. It really takes both. I've talked about this before. It used to be the theory that if you have a big drop off after day 3, that it's a sperm issue, but it's just not necessarily the case. We'd have to look at, you know, the parameters for the sperm, you know, what the andrologist saw, what the embryologist saw, if the sperm looked normal, if they were swimming well, and then we also evaluate the eggs at the time of ICSI so we can grade the eggs, good, fair, or poor. So if you had overall poor egg quality, then you might think it's an egg issue. There's really, unfortunately, not an exact way to tell. This question is, would you recommend a day 5 4AA or a day 6 5AA FET? They're pretty similar. So we typically start with the day 5, just because they're a little bit more likely to be euploid or normal in terms of the chromosomes, like a very small amount, more likely to be normal, but that doesn't mean that your day 6 isn't normal. If we did the day 6 5AA, we wouldn't have to do assisted hatching because your embryo is already hatching. So I guess maybe it depends on if assisted hatching, if you've already paid for it or if it's included. I don't know anything about the financials, but that would really be the only difference, is we would have to do assisted hatching on the 4AA, but we wouldn't have to do assisted hatching on the 5AA because the 5 means that it's already hatching. Yeah, you can ask the embryologist what your eggs were graded. It's just our overall impression. So as we're doing your ICSI, we're getting an overall impression of the eggs. Are they difficult to inject? Is there fragmentation? Are the polar bodies normal? Are there any vacuoles? Is the, you know, sometimes the eggs are really soft when we go to inject them. Sometimes it's almost like injecting concrete, honestly, and you're like, ooh, these ones are really tough. So we're not, you know, every time we inject, we're not writing down this egg was good, this egg was fair, this egg was poor, because it's very, very time sensitive. We can only have the eggs out of the incubator for a few minutes. So when we're doing our ICSI, we're doing like a million crazy things with joysticks and pumps and needles, and we're just trying to get the ICSI done. So really we're keeping track in our head. So we might do 6 eggs, might have 6 eggs in the dish, and we're just going this egg, this egg, this egg, and I'm thinking, okay, there's like 3 good, 3 fair. So we can definitely give you an overall impression if you had good egg quality. I hope that makes sense. I was just reading Sarah's question about the embryos that she has left. That might be worth messaging your embryology team. We can take a look at the photos of the embryos and look at which ones you've already transferred and which you have left. And also maybe get input from a doctor if they think you should do another retrieval. But we can certainly, if you send a message through your portal, we can look at what you've transferred, what you have left, and if we have any insight. So this patient had 19 retrieved and ended up with 2 embryos. So we'd have to look at where the drop-off occurred for you. It could be that your eggs weren't all mature, so you may have gotten 19 eggs, but we'd have to see how many we were actually able to ICSI, and then how many fertilized. So there's different drop-off points. And then we'd see how many we had on day 3. Did you end up with 2 on day 3, or did you end up with 2 once we held them out to the blast stage? And then we could look at your egg and sperm quality and see if there was anything that came up that we would want to do differently next time. So it's kind of, you'd want some information from the embryologist about what happened in your cycle, and then you'd want to follow up with a physician to discuss what could be changed. Do you give us pictures of our thawed, re-expanded, and hatched embryos with FETs? So we take a picture right after the thaw, and that's the picture that gets put in your portal and that we print out. We just don't have the time to repicture and print right before each embryo transfer. So you do get a picture of your embryo, but it is right after it's thawed. If not testing, do you advise transferring at cleavage stage, which is day 3, versus blast? It's really going to depend on how many embryos you have. If you're comfortable holding out to the blastocyst stage, there's a little bit better success with blastocyst embryos, but that could be because patients who are struggling to get embryos or are a little bit older, making less embryos, tend to do day 3 embryo transfers. So that might skew the statistics to make the day 3 embryos look a little less successful, but it's probably what we're starting with that's making it less successful, not specific, not specifically the one good embryo if you transferred it on day 3 or day 5. If an embryo is free AA on day 5, do you ever keep them until day 6 to hatch? 3 day 5. No, we wouldn't hold them in the lab just to wait for them to hatch. We would want to freeze the embryos at that 3 stage. So once they're an expanded blastocyst and we can see the different cell lines, so we can see the inner cell mass is differentiated from the trophectoderm, then we just want to freeze. We want to put them away, get them safely frozen. So if you have a 3AA day 5 and a 4AA day 6, they're essentially equivalent. We would typically just start with the day 5. All right, I'm just scrolling up here to see if there's any other questions. Can you do PGT testing on a day 3 embryo? No, we have to grow the embryos to the blastocyst stage, so day 5, 6, or 7, in order to do the PGT testing. So if you have a day 3 embryo that's already frozen, you could always thaw the embryo, try to get it to grow to day 5 or 6, and try to biopsy them then. So there's, a chance that could be done, but it's also risky that you could thaw your embryo and it won't grow to day 5 in order to be biopsied. If you have a day 5 4BB and a day 6 4BB, we would go with the day 5. A day 3 3-8 and a 2-4, decent. Yep. So that means you have one embryo that's good, which is the 3. That's what the 3 stands for. And the 8 means it has 8 cells. So it's a good embryo with 8 cells. And then a 2-4, the 2 means fair, and the 4 means 4 cells. So a fair embryo with 4 cells. Zymot is doing pretty well for us, I think. It's kind of nice for the embryologist because the sample that we get is only motile sperm. So anything that went through the zygote is swimming. So we get a nice clean sample to work with. Our normal sperm prep is totally fine as well. But we do like zygote too. It's going well. Sometimes we get these new technologies and we don't really like them, but I don't mind the zygote. If you're looking to talk to the embryology department, we don't have any direct phone number because we're not actually in the area where we can answer the phone all day. We're in the lab. So if you're looking to contact your embryology team, the best way is to send a message through the portal. So find your lab, Embryology Syracuse, Albany, Buffalo, Colorado. So this is a good question. So we usually transfer on day 3 or day 5. Is it uncommon or rare to transfer on day 4? So the reason that we don't do transfers on day 4 is because on day 4, the embryos are kind of in this intermediate stage. So on day 3, we can count the cells, we can grade them. On day 5, we can see the 2 different parts of the embryos and we can grade them. On day 4, they just look like a blob, to be honest. So that's what the morula is. So let me see if I have a picture here. The morula. Okay, so day 4 is when all the cells start to compact together. Whoop, right there. And it just looks like a big blob. So we can't count the cells. We don't know if it's going to make it to a blastocyst. It means it's trying. That's the appropriate stage for day 4. But in general, it's difficult to evaluate them on day 4. So if you ended up doing a day 4 transfer because of some scheduling conflict, it's fine. It's totally fine, but it's harder for the embryologist to pick out the best embryos. So I think that's why generally in the field we don't do day 4. We don't evaluate them on day 4. We just leave them in the incubator. They're working hard, trying to make a blastocyst, and that would be why. Do you look at the pictures of the frozen embryo and then decide which ones look best for transfer? So yeah, kind of. So if it's a frozen embryo transfer, we're going to pick the best graded ones, which means when we originally froze the embryos, we were grading them, we were looking at all of them, and we have a grade and a ranking system, and we know which ones look the best. If it's a fresh transfer, then we can look at them that morning, right before your transfer when you're actually here in the building. And sometimes we have 3 embryos that we would call 4AA, and it's just like, ooh, which one do you like a little bit better? So we can just pick out which ones are closest to the ideal. How do we recognize the embryos for each person? So our embryos are labeled clearly. Well, our incubators, let me start from the beginning. When we do an egg retrieval, if I'm your embryologist, I'm going to be wearing a sticker on my hand that has your name, date of birth, ID number, your partner's name, date of birth, and ID number. And I'm going to wear that sticker the whole time that I'm working with your eggs. When I go to the OR to get the eggs, they have stickers on the door. I'm going to grab another sticker, make sure they match. Anytime I'm getting tubes from the OR, we always are verifying that we have the right patient. We only do 1 patient at a time in the OR, so there should never be an issue there anyway. There's only 1 retrieval going on at a time. And then in the lab, you are assigned an incubator spot just for your embryos. So that same sticker and then labeling system is on the outside of the incubator, and then each dish that the embryos are in are labeled as well. So anytime we're moving embryos or doing a transfer, we have the incubators labeled, your dishes are labeled. When we freeze the embryos, I've shown this before, but we have these little they're called cryolocks, but these little plastic devices that we freeze the embryos on, and that has a label on it with your name, date of birth, ID number, and the grade of the embryos. So we have lots of ID everywhere. Do we do retrievals and transfers on Saturdays and Sundays? We don't do any retrievals or transfers on Sunday. We are open Saturdays. It's more like a half day. But if a retrieval has to happen on a Saturday, it will. Transfers, usually we like to just do fresh transfers on Saturday. Frozen embryo transfers, they have a little bit more wiggle room with when they can schedule you. So we're open. Embryology is in the building 7 days a week, but the doctors are here, doctors and nurses, Monday through Saturday. We're the only ones here on Sunday and on Christmas, on Thanksgiving, and Labor Day, and all the other holidays. So your embryos are well taken care of. This question is asking, how can we tell egg quality? So there's just certain characteristics of the eggs that make it a little less good quality. It actually really isn't always indicative of whether you're going to have success or not, but we do note it so that we, if we see anything unusual, we'll note that. So we're looking at, the cytoplasm in the egg. Does it have dark spots? Is it grainy? Is the polar body fragmented? When we go to inject the egg, is it soft? Is it like hard? It's kind of like when you have a really good egg that you're injecting, you're just like, oh, this is the perfect egg. It just gets ICSI'd very easily. There's no graininess to it. Sometimes eggs can be a little too soft. Sometimes they can get dark and grainy. That would be poorer quality. We don't typically report the egg quality because that's just one piece of the puzzle. We're more concerned with how the quality of the embryos, because that's the sperm and the egg, and how they came together. So sometimes we'll have eggs that we graded as poor quality, and then they grow and they make really nice embryos. And then, we're like, oh, I guess that was fine. So we do have an overall impression of your egg quality, but it's not something that you're going to see on a report. I'll just answer one more question. So we're going on almost 40 minutes. Okay, awesome. So how do you select which sperm to use for ICSI? Is it somewhat random? So we're just looking for what we would call the most handsome sperm, I guess. So yeah, we have a whole, like you say, a pool of sperm. So there's a drop, we load some in there, and we're up on the microscope and they're all just swimming around. And we're gonna pick the ones that have the most normal shape. So we're looking at the head of the sperm, the tail, is it swimming straight, and is it swimming relatively fast? So we want one that's moving forward in a relatively straight line, relatively quickly, and is the correct shape. There's all sorts of abnormally shaped sperm. Maybe next time I'll show you pictures of that. They can look pretty wonky. So just to reiterate, you'll get grades of your embryos and photos once they're all frozen, so at the completion of the cycle. So if you had an egg retrieval, it's going to be about a week later that you're going to get that report in your portal. If we're done freezing your eggs on a Saturday or Sunday, or your embryos on a Saturday or Sunday, Monday is when you're going to get the report, because that's when we have our lab assistants. They're not here on the weekend doing the reports, but Monday they catch up on all the reports from the weekend. All right. So thank you so much for all your questions today. Feel free to keep asking questions and I'll look at them and it'll help me decide what to talk about next time. All right. So thank you, everybody. I'll see you next month. So it's the second Tuesday of every month I'm going to be doing these lives. All right. Okay, have a good day. Thank you. Bye.